just upstairs, my little comfortable study.
Oh, nice. What state are you in?
I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Oh, wow. So way, way across, 3,000 miles away.
Yes.
Wow.
We're not next door neighbors.
Yeah. So what is it? It's like 3 p.m. or something?
Up middle of the afternoon here in Michigan.
Mm-hmm. Oh, are we live now?
Yeah, so we're live. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm the Behavioral Health Director here at Two Feathers Native American Family Services, and we're on our virtual suicide prevention speaker series. We have a wonderful guest today, Dr. Cheryl King, and we also have my colleague, Zara Shine. Before I turn it over to Zara to introduce herself, I just want to let everybody know that Two Feathers, where we're currently located, is on Wiyot land, the Wiyot people. And so we want to pay honor and respect to the land of the Wiyot people. And we also want to thank everybody for tuning in. And so Zara, who is the first time getting on our speaker series, is going to introduce herself, and then I'll introduce Cheryl.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zara Shine. I am a mental health clinician here at Two Feathers Native American Family Services. The services I provide are part of the Garrett Lee Smith Suicide Prevention Grant. Our program is CHEKWS for Hope for Tomorrow, which serves 10 to 18-year-olds in Humboldt County through mainly through 2 school districts. So the goal of our program is to create sustainable mental health programs specifically for Native American youth, to make these clinical programs more culturally significant and effective for serving this population. And so part of our speaker series is, bringing in the leading experts on how to make our program just that much more effective and to really be on that cutting edge of providing the best services possible to these children in these rural areas that traditionally haven't had access to these really high levels of care. So that's something we're committed to here at Two Feathers. So thank you, Dr. Cheryl King, for joining us today.
Yes, and thank you for introducing yourself, Zara. A little bit about our excellent presenter today and real leader in suicide work, especially among adolescents, is Dr. Cheryl King. She's a professor in the departments of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I have to say, I spent a year in Michigan doing my pre-doctoral internship at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I live right by the hospital. Dr. King is an international expert on youth suicide prevention intervention. She has focused a lot of her career on improving suicide risk screening, assessment, and intervention strategies for teens with suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Dr. King serves on the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention Scientific Advisory Board. And so with that introduction, welcome, Dr. King. I believe the plan is for Dr. King to do a presentation, which we'll share our screen, and then we'll have some questions among Zara and I. Will ask some questions, but then those of you that are tuning in on Facebook Live, you can shoot some questions through the comment section, and we'll be sure to ask Dr. King. So welcome, Dr. King.
Thank you. And thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really delighted to join you and your community today. We always look for opportunities to spread the word. We work on this research, but we like to share our findings too. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to tell you about a couple of different initiatives that may have some pearls here or there that may be of interest or something you can make use of. And one is an intervention that we've developed and studied, the Youth Nominated Support Team intervention. And then the other is some of our work on the importance of connectedness. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I'm going to start and tell you about the Youth Nominated Support Team intervention. This is something that grew out of my work. I'm a clinical child and adolescent psychologist. In my initial position at the University of Michigan was as the psychologist for the adolescent psychiatric inpatient unit for the hospital. And many of the teens who were on our hospital unit were there because of suicide risk. And I had worked with them for several years, and it became really apparent that the stays were short, but often the problems that put them at risk for suicide, they were ongoing. They were not problems we could resolve in a short hospital stay. And when the teens went home with their families, it was overwhelming for the families that they were going to wait for a follow-up appointment, that they were taking home their child who was still at risk for suicide, that there weren't more supports around them as they moved from the hospital back to the community. And that was really where this intervention came from, that work. So you're probably aware that across the US, the suicide is now the second leading cause of death. And that it has been increasing the rate of suicide in our country. The other important piece, just from our epidemiology, and of course, this is the whole US, not specific to your community or my community, but that males, boys and men, account for about 3/4 of all the youth suicides. So we're always looking with our interventions to be sure we're not only reaching the girls at risk, who are actually more likely to go in for mental health services, they're more likely to share their distress, but we also want to try to design screening tools and interventions to reach the boys and the young men at risk. And again, as you may be aware, this is just showing age of onset and why we're so concerned about teens. And what you have across the bottom horizontal line here are ages of youth. And you can see it's starting at age 4 and going to age 18 as you move from left to right. And it's pretty flat. It does exist. Unfortunately, the tragedy of suicide happens even at young ages. But you can see it's really around 12, 13, 14 that the slope of that line, or how steep it is, begins to rise. And that is true for suicidal thoughts, for attempts, and for deaths by suicide. In terms of some of our national data on high school students and how commonly they have these thoughts of suicide, you can see the turquoise are the girls and the more royal blue are the boys. The girls more often report that they seriously think about suicide, that they've made suicide plans, and they're about twice as likely now to report that they've made a suicide attempt. And that's actually quite different than what I shared a couple slides back about the rate of death by suicide. So whereas girls share it more and make more attempts, boys are actually significantly more likely to die by suicide. So that's just a little bit of kind of the data to set the stage. And then what is the Youth Nominated Support Team? This is actually based in social support models, in health behavior models, and health behavior interventions have been used for many years before this in other areas of medicine. They were used with chronic diseases like diabetes, asthma, coronary heart disease. And what they're trying to do is to help people follow through and adhere with treatment, self-regulate, get the support they do to do the best they can do, given that they have a chronic disease. And it seemed that it might be helpful to apply some of these same models to youth who are at risk for suicide to supplement our usual treatments. So our traditional treatments in mental health, right, they tend to be counseling or psychotherapy, one-on-one talk therapies. We have an evidence base for these now, and then we have medication. But both of these the therapy tends to be office-based. You go once a week or you go every other week. It's not necessarily in your community. It's in a health system, an agency, a mental health clinic. And then you're taking the medication, hopefully regularly, as prescribed. Those are very traditional treatments. But what they don't do is meet all of the needs of the youth at risk for suicide. They're treating their individual ways of thinking and behavior. Maybe the medication is addressing some target symptoms. But in terms of their network in the family and community and all the potential supports, they're often not impacted by our traditional treatments. So what happens in YST is that youth are invited to nominate up to 4 adults they trust, they know, and they think might be helpful to them as they transition from the hospital back to the community. So when it was first developed, the idea of it was to help with that transition where they're getting 24/7 care, people are watching over them, they're in the hospital, and then they're going to be discharged, usually within 1 to 2 weeks or less, and they're going to go home and wait for a first weekly appointment. So they nominate adults. These don't have to be people they see a lot. It might be a teacher they had last year, but they felt like they could share things with this teacher. They felt like they trusted them. In truth, we had a wide range of adults nominated, a lot of aunts and grandmothers. We had parents, we had teachers, we had youth group leaders, we had piano teacher, we had a minister and a rabbi, a coach from an athletic team, so quite a wide range. And the idea of YST, there are 2 important pieces. One is that the youth are identifying these adults, because most of what happens in our care systems is we assign people to work with people. It's not empowering in that way. And here the youth are empowered. They're nominating the adults. The parents, of course, they're going to sign a release that we can talk to these adults. They have veto power. They rarely used it, but they have it. But it's not just that the youth nominate adults. The other key part of this intervention is that we work with these adults so that they're informed support people who understand what's going on in the youth, what the difficulties are and the strengths, why treatments have been recommended. They have a chance to ask any questions they want. And we contact them every week to support them in their role as support people. So they're informed and supported adults making up this network. This work was actually funded by our National Institute of Mental Health. And so we did a study after designing this, and I worked with 2 psychiatric hospitals in Michigan, and we did a randomized controlled trial in the sense that the youth who were eligible and agreed to participate, they were all adolescents, 13 to 17 years. They were all hospitalized because of suicide risk. And then like a flip of a coin, we randomized them to either get usual treatment, in other words, the usual recommendations when they left the hospital. Almost always this was combination treatment, psychotherapy and medication, or they were randomized to usual treatment plus the youth nominated support team. Because keeping in mind, this isn't meant to be a standalone treatment or intervention. It's meant to be a supplement to these usual treatments. We used a computer. Obviously, we had parent consent and youth assent. And because it was randomized, really like the flip of a coin, if you flip a coin 448 times, your number of heads or tails will be pretty even at that point. And most of the characteristics, so the 2 groups were very, very similar. And this is just to show this for those of you who might be interested in the scientific side of this. You can see in both groups, the average age was 15.6, about 15 and a half years. They were both about 70% girls. They both had quite high scores. This is the Children's Depression Rating Scale revised. These are well above a clinical depression threshold, scores of 60, 61. These are high scores for suicidal thoughts. And you can see that these are percentages in the parentheses, that a history of suicide attempt was about 1/3 of each group. And also a pretty good percentage had a history of multiple suicide attempts. So a very high risk sample. Just some other differences that people have asked me about since some of our work was published. The number of girls and boys with histories of multiple suicide attempts did not differ between groups. And this was thought to be important because boys are at higher risk for death by suicide. So if they were uneven and one group had more boys with high risk, that could account for the differences. And then you get an idea a bit more about the teens who are psychiatrically hospitalized for suicide risk. Many of them, almost 4 out of 5 in both groups, had a history of prior mental health care. And their average age with their first mental health care was about age 12. And a quarter of them, 27 and 24%, one of their parents had made a suicide attempt too, and a fair amount of trauma in our samples. So I mentioned that these adolescents nominated these adults. We brought them in and we provided regular support, and the parents agreed to the nominations. Excuse me. On average, each adolescent in the intervention had more than 3 support people who participated. And what did we do to bring them in for the education piece? It was about an hour. We left it flexible. They could come in for their own session. They could come in with other nominated people. For instance, we might have had an aunt and uncle come in together, or a mother and a grandmother come in together. Sometimes people came in individually. And what happened during that hour plus? First, we asked them just to talk about the youth, their relationship with the youth. They were often taken with the fact that the youth wanted them to be more involved in their life. And we told them about YST and what their role would be. Then we shared the youth's formal treatment plan in the hospital and their problem list. We invited and responded to all their questions. They were wide-ranging. Why is this treatment recommended for bipolar disorder? How long does someone stay on an antidepressant medication? What am I supposed to say if the youth tells me nothing is helping? You know, we just responded to all of the questions they came up with. So in this way, each session was very tailored to the youth and the support person. It was framed by the youth's treatment plan, and it was framed by the support people's questions about the youth and the plan and the recommended treatments. Then we talked some just tips for communicating with teens, but keeping in mind that these support people were nominated by the teens, so the teens presumably were comfortable talking with them. And then we emphasize how might they encourage treatment adherence, and if the opportunity presented itself, how could they lean in on the side of making positive behavior choices? So their role was not to be a mental health professional. It wasn't to give the teen a lot of advice, but it was to be there for them, to encourage adherence with recommended treatments. And just if the opportunity came up in their discussions, to kind of lean or weigh in on making positive choices. And of course, we left them with some emergency information. We asked them to have regular contact with the youth. Then, as I mentioned, we touch base with them by phone every week to answer any new questions and be a support to them. So what did we find? We followed all of these youth. We met them in person multiple times over the first year after they left the hospital. We measured everything. We did this more than 15 years ago. And at that point in time, at least as a psychologist, we liked our long scales and we measured. We had a lot of data. And I can say that nothing was negative, no outcomes, but our positive effects were pretty modest. There were more rapid decreases in suicidal thoughts for the YST group. But the main thing was they did participate in more treatment. We didn't find a difference in some of the big outcomes like suicide attempts, long-lasting reductions in suicidal thoughts, but they had more treatment. And as you can see, there were 29 attempts in the YST group and 35 TAU is treatment as usual. Not a significant difference, maybe a trend, but barely. Yet our team was so invested in this intervention. And the team of intervention specialists felt very strongly, had a lot of case examples that they were making a difference in the lives of some of these teens and their families. And what we wanted to do a number of years later was, well, let's just follow up. This is a big sample. People haven't really ever followed up, at least in our nation that we know of, a sample of teens who were known to be at high risk for suicide. So we went to our IRB and got permission to request the National Death Index data, which comes from the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia. And we've got all of the data on all of these 440 some teens through 2016. So this means it was an 11 to 14 year follow-up. There were 15 deaths. This was difficult. I mean, this was sad to read some of these outcomes. These were all youth we had met multiple times. And then we confirmed the 15 deaths with state death certificates. All of the youth had died in the state of Michigan, and we were able to get all of those with a little bit more information. But what we had were 13 deaths in the treatment as usual group and only 2 in the YST group. That's a hazard ratio of 6.6. Now, it's by chance, right? Because as a clinical scientist, in addition to being a clinician, we're interested in probability statistics. And could this difference have happened by chance? It could have, but this P is the probability level. Only 4 out of 1,000 times would you get that big a difference by chance. In other words, it's really unlikely you're going to flip a coin 15 times and only get 2 heads or only get 2 tails. But in many areas of medicine, mortality outcome studies are much, much, much bigger. You can look at some studies of cancer, of coronary heart disease. They've literally studied thousands of people. In mental health, we don't have that. This is the biggest mortality outcome study I know of with teens at risk for suicide, and yet it's only 448 youth. Now, when you have smaller samples like this, you are more likely to get extreme findings. And that's why rather than look at the probability statistics, what we usually recommend is that people look at this confidence interval. It's called the 95% of the time you could have confidence that the actual difference between the YST and the other group in the hazard ratio, the odds of dying by suicide, rather than the 6.6, it's somewhere between 1.5 and 29, which means at the lowest end, there would be a 50% reduction in mortality with this intervention. Now, that's actually pretty amazing that a supplemental intervention could potentially, obviously it should be replicated, but there's no negative effects. It actually takes the youth's existing community network and strengthens it. Some of these people, they knew the youth, but they didn't know all of this about the youth. They didn't know what the youth was struggling with. They didn't know how they might be more helpful. And even though we only supported them every week for 3 months, they were still in the youth's life. They now had this information and they could continue to be a support for the youth as they moved into young adulthood. Now, this difference was with any cause of mortality. Then we also looked, there were no natural causes of death. That's not unusual at this age. But when we looked only at the deaths that either were by suicide or by drug overdose with unknown intent. So we didn't count the ones if they said it was definitely accidental, but where they couldn't tell if it was accidental or not, and the suicides, it still remained significant. There were 8 deaths like that in the treatment as usual and only 1 in YST. And as you can see down here at the bottom, for girls and boys, very similar to what's been shown before, really for both groups, that we had more males than females die by suicide. And the sample itself, we did have more girls. And this shows you that the deaths, the differences between the 2 groups. The red is the treatment as usual. It's a survival probability. So what we'd like is to see everyone stay up here at the very top. A 1 is survival all the way across the years of follow-up. This is 1 year after hospitalization, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 15 years after. And every down tick was a death of one of the youth. And this is obviously, I've exaggerated this so you can see it better. As you'll notice, what we call the y-axis or the vertical line, there's a split here. So I'm emphasizing the differences, but I think what's apparent is not only the differences between groups, but the fact it doesn't happen right after the hospital or necessarily a few years later. These are people who whose lives were lost all the way across the follow-up period. So what it suggests is that this intervention, may well help. I'm working now to try to replicate some where we can, to try to adapt it with newer technologies. Now one advantage, it's so wonderful, just like our video conference here, the youth, when we did this, which was in between about 2002 and 2005, they had to nominate people who were close enough by to come in for these education sessions. Now they can nominate a grandparent who lives in another state, and we're able to involve that grandparent, and that grandparent can stay connected through some of the technology we have available. So we're continuing to work on this. Now, just to turn for a bit, and then I think we'll take about 5 or 10 minutes to tell you a little bit more of what we're learning about the importance of social connectedness, and then we can open it for your questions. So what we've studied are what predicts what teen will make a suicide attempt within 3 months. And in another current large scale study that I'm just finishing with 2 colleagues, David Brent, who's a child psychiatrist in Pittsburgh, and Jackie Grubb-Phelan, who is a pediatric emergency medicine physician at the University of California, San Francisco. And the three of us have been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health for the last 6 years to develop a more optimal suicide risk screen for teens that could be used to recognize risk in general medical emergency departments. So whatever reason teens come in, a sports injury, alcohol poisoning, they slam their thumb in the car door, exacerbation of a chronic medical illness, influenza, we would screen them all so that we can recognize the girls and the boys at risk, because girls and boys both are coming into our medical emergency department for these reasons. But as we've been developing this suicide risk screen, we also had a chance to do this study because we were following them 3 months later to see what predicted which youth made a suicide attempt. And there have been papers published that single risk factors do poorly. Those of you who are clinicians have known this for a very long time. Social workers, clinical psychologists, counselors, we're not ever using a single risk factor and thinking it's going to predict who's at risk, right? We're always considering kind of a multifactorial model that risk is many factors go into suicide risk, and youth who are suicidal are highly heterogeneous. So it's different combinations of risk factors for different youth. Unfortunately, though, we previously have not had large enough studies to be able to put multiple risk factors together in our prediction models. And what we were able to do here, not only put multiple factors, but you'll see we were able to look at what predicted a suicide attempt specifically in male adolescents. What predicted a suicide attempt specifically in adolescents who, when we screened them in the emergency department, they said they didn't have any suicidal thoughts. Yet we know they made an attempt. What predicted it in those adolescents? So this is a big study. It's called ED STARS. We worked with 14 pediatric emergency departments in the US, including one that serves the White Mountain Apache tribal nation in the Public Health Service Hospital. And of course, that's because of the higher rate of suicide characterizing that particular subgroup. So we had over 2,000 youth with 3-month outcome data. These are teens. And what did we find? Just about everything we measured, univariate, meaning if you looked at one variable at a time, all of these variables significantly predicted who made an attempt. Not all youth who made an attempt had all of them, but they were all present enough to differentiate those who made attempts and didn't. In a sense, this replicates what we already know from a bunch of studies. It's just that it all came together in this study. So past week suicidal thoughts. NSSI here refers to non-suicidal self-injury. The number of different methods youth use is important, as well as the number of incidents. Have they ever made a suicide attempt before in their lifetime? How long do they say their suicidal thoughts last? So youth who told us, I can't get it off my mind, I think about suicide for several hours a day, were more likely than those who had thoughts, but they were fleeting thoughts. Alcohol, marijuana, all of these were risk factors, and these as well. Youth who self-identified as a sexual minority, a gender identity minority, hopelessness, some of the things we sometimes don't talk about, like aggression, getting in physical fights more often. Not just the people who are victimized, but the youth who are bullying or victimizing others are also at risk. And low connectedness is on the list. So then what we did, because there's 30 some predictors here, This is a lot to try to take account of when you're trying to come up with a risk formulation. So we were able to put them in a model and see what's still in the model. And the way this works is that although those were 30 different clinical and social factors that were significant predictors, a lot of them co-vary. They're overlapping. And so when you have one, you don't need others in the model to predict, because the same youth have quite a number of them. In the full sample, these were the only four things that remain. And these would be very important clinically to assess in any risk assessment: recent suicidal thoughts, the lifetime severity of SI, suicidal ideation, the lifetime history, have they ever engaged in suicidal behavior, and school connectedness. Now, it doesn't mean they need to have all four, but all four of these contribute to the prediction of who makes an attempt. And I think what's interesting is that of all those other factors, right? Impulsivity, aggression, sleep disturbance, hopelessness, depression, anxiety, they all fell out once you included suicidal ideation and history of behavior, because they're kind of on that pathway to that. And connectedness stays in. And I think that's because it's getting out of that psychiatric symptom domain and giving you another domain of risk for young people. And that is not feeling connected. And what did we measure? This is a very, very short school connectedness scale. It's tapping a sense that I belong at school. I have someone to turn to if I need to at school. It's a sense of I belong there. It's safe for me there, and I have someone to turn to. Then, as I mentioned, we looked for teens who'd never reported ideation when they were in the emergency department, but they made a suicide attempt within 3 months. For these teens, it was just two things: the lifetime severity, the worst they've ever had, the most severe suicidal ideation, and again, connectedness. School and social connectedness were kind of interchangeable. Either one could go in the model. One was a little better in one model, the other in the other. This is just with peers your age, that sense of belonging, someone you trust, someone to turn to. And then the males who it's been very difficult in our field to learn how to recognize risk in male teens and to learn how to do solid risk formulations. Here, it was all about ideation and the severity. Females, we also had non-suicidal self-injury, and social connectedness shows up. Now, connectedness was not on the male list, but again, we didn't have as many males who made attempts, and it might be with a bigger sample, we would learn more about connectedness in males. I want to acknowledge, of course, these projects, both of these projects I've told you about. I have this fabulous group of people I work with and colleagues in other states, and I'm just doing like a bit of like a whole bunch of work, but I want to especially acknowledge my colleagues and students and people who are training with us, because we keep each other energized for this work and consult regularly. So let me stop there, and I really do welcome any questions that you have, and I'll stop the screen share.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I can't even imagine just how much like effort and time that you've put into these studies. And one of the things that I'm curious about, because the issue of suicide is such a deeply personal thing that has probably touched some of our viewers in very impactful ways. And I just, I'm curious what kind of inspired your focus on this subject, or your intention for your the applications of this research?
Yeah, So what inspired, how I got in this field originally was simply, I was going back to work and this was available. Now that sounds simple. A lot of things have inspired my ideas and what I'm working on, but I trained as a clinical child psychologist. And if any of you listening are in training, sometimes people feel they have to be on very straight trajectories in their career. And I always say, just go in and do your best work every day and you will have opportunities. But I, as a graduate student, I actually studied communication strengths and deficits of children diagnosed with ADHD. And then I was out of the workforce when my children were born. And when I was ready to go back in the workforce, I looked at what opportunities were in clinical child and adolescent psychology where I was living. And I took a postdoctoral fellowship to work with teenagers and to learn more about psychiatric inpatient care and to work with mentors who studied suicide risk. And I was really, really motivated to do that and expand from, I had been working with elementary age to look at what are the primary presenting problems we have when you move to work with adolescents. And a lot of the primary presenting problems, as you all know, in adolescents, they are mood-related, depression-related problems, and risk-taking behaviors. And when you work with suicide risk, you're working with mood and risk-taking difficulties. In terms of inspiring the particular line of work, the development of the Youth Nominate Support Team really came from working with the families of suicidal teens. I had been at the University of Michigan for about 9 years as the lead psychologist for the adolescent unit before I designed YST. In terms of the ED STARS study, which has been a massive undertaking, it was the most exciting opportunity to be able to do something on a large enough scale to have definitive findings. Now, for those of you who are scientists, I think you'll appreciate this. For others, I think you'll also appreciate that research can be kind of a forever endeavor. And to some, it seems like it's, lots of numbers, lots of detail. And the truth is, I had already done a lot of studies on risk factors. But as with many others, we conclude our studies with, but our sample was sort of small. We can't be sure. Further study is needed, bigger studies, longer term studies. And here the federal government was offering to fund a team. We had to apply, it was competitive, but big teams applied. And with sufficient funding to get a geographically distributed sample with thousands of youth, so that maybe for the first time for me, my work on risk factors, I could finish it and say, well, this is pretty definitive. So that was a long answer to probably a short question.
No, thank you so much. I can relate. When I did my thesis, I was focused on help-seeking behaviors because of that problem, the misalignment between need and people actually accessing those professional services when they need help for mental health symptoms. And what came out of that was that gender was the biggest predictor. So I ended up doing my thesis on the relationships between conformity of traditional masculine norms, symptom severity, and help-seeking intention. So looking at the interaction between the symptom severity and the level of conformity to traditional masculinity. And of course, with my sample size and everything, a lot of my discussion also read, in a similar way of like, we need a bigger sample size, more some severe symptoms, and also interestingly, the college student population of males that I sampled didn't really necessarily have the same relationship to help-seeking behaviors as we see nationally. So there may be something interesting about male college students that come to Humboldt County. We have a certain demographic, cultural bubble here. So that was an interesting finding.
Yeah. But you know, what's nice about what you did and really important is you were highly programmatic. And I think that's the way we learn, because we build what we learn from one study informs the next. And as soon as we finish a study in our group, we like to sit there and brainstorm. Now, what questions did this raise? In a way, you designed one based on what you'd already learned. And that, plus being just thoughtful about what we learn and how far can we generalize it. Like, you know, you learned a lot about the group you had, and you know it'll apply to some others, but maybe not to others. And I guess that's how we sort of build our field, by being programmatic and asking more questions.
So, and that line, you know, your study was looking at the youth nominated support team post hospitalization. And of course, you know, at Two Feathers, you know, we have a lot of connections with our youth and might be seeing just the warning signs of before someone is potentially needing hospitalization. What do you think about using this type of model as more of a preventative, maybe as like part of an enhanced safety plan when youth are just beginning to maybe start having those ideations or behaviors, but before they might meet that threshold to be hospitalized?
I mean, absolutely. I actually think this model, because it's not a prescribed scripted therapy, right? It's more of a framework. And I think this could be used with youth in schools, with youth at risk with different kinds of problems. I am right now, except for COVID-19, is, you know, I'm kind of in a hold, but we are piloting it in the emergency department.
Oh, great.
Because many youth are not psychiatrically hospitalized because they're at risk, but they can go home. This varies by community, but in my community, we only hospitalize about a third of the youth who come to an emergency department for suicide risk. And we thought, well, we would like to offer this to all these youth coming in. Can we get it launched in the emergency department? It's a little challenging. They're not there a long time. There's often crowding, but that's what we're piloting now. And I would say, absolutely. I personally believe in earlier prevention. And I think one of the things that I've learned from my own longitudinal outcome studies is that the more severe the problems are, the harder it is to alter the trajectory. And the earlier in there, you know, earlier on that we can try to move things, the better our odds are, I think, of really making a difference. And it's some of it because the problems get entrenched, but also because problems beget problems and they exacerbate each other. You know, like depression and alcohol misuse can each make each other worse. And then when you have both, you're going to likely have more social conflict or disengagement, and then you might have problems at school. And it doesn't go uphill from there. So I think to begin this type of intervention with youth who are at mild risk for adverse outcomes would be actually preferable.
Right, and intervene in that cascade of trajectory a lot sooner, right? Like even using that screening tool, maybe school-wide at some of the schools we work with.
Absolutely.
Do we have questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have one from Dessa Gunning, and she was asking, did you notice any cultural connection in the White Mountain study? Like, and just maybe unpacking a little bit of the differences around whether it's gender or culture in the engagement or the implementation of the programs you've discussed?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question. To date, We've only looked at the full sample. So that was our White Mountain Apache Tribal Nation participated in the ED STARS with the prediction of suicide risk. And we haven't gone in separately to look at their data yet. We do have about 100 youth from the tribal community that participated. And if actually I'd welcome this group's ideas of what particular questions, but I get part of it is, you know, where does the culture fit in? Where does this mental health model fit in? Where does connectedness? I'd like to look at the connectedness. We actually have social connectedness, school connectedness, and family connectedness. And I wonder if there might be hypotheses about the different profiles of risk, and might it look different when we examine only that subgroup. But I don't have your answers today.
That's okay. That makes sense though. And one other question, and this is sort of kind of a thought that I had too, around, you know, I think a big part of the work is engagement and looking at implementation and how do you get buy-in. And so we have a question from Jennifer Francis, Jennifer Oliphant. She actually is our director of the Garrett Lee Suicide Prevention Program here at Two Feathers. But she's wondering what happens if youth are unable to establish the national support? What have you found?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, there are some, and I'd have to look at, it was less than 5%. I think it was 3 or 4% of youth, even with facilitation. Now, we weren't, because this was research, we weren't able to enroll them. So I don't know their outcomes, but there was this 3% who didn't nominate them, or even when we brought the parent in to help them nominate. And my guess is that was a very high risk group. But that means that about 97% could, but it was a facilitated process. So we had a mental health professional, I'm not sure it would need to be a trained mental health professional, who facilitated the nominations. And what it was working with the youth to consider each domain. So their family, their extended family, their school, community, their neighborhood, their family, friends, and the adults among that group, their religious or spiritual affiliations. And we would move through them and think, because sometimes a youth's first response was, there's nobody. Well, they'd come up with one person. Because they're thinking this has to be someone who talks with them a lot now about personal things. And for most teens, that's very few, if any, adults, but it's not a big number. And so we kind of have to work with them to think about, well, who do you trust? You know, sometimes they nominated a teacher they had last year, because as you sit with them and give them time to reflect, they think of adults they've trusted, even if they're not in contact with them a lot right now. So far and away, the majority of adults can do this. I think it's probably in itself a risk factor if a youth with facilitation cannot nominate an adult. Or they had to nominate 2. So people would for this, because nominating their parent, of course, their parents were already participating with them in treatment.
So it seems like, you know, as a quick follow-up, that it's really important to be competent and creative in being able to engage with the adolescents and the children, so that, you know, down the road, they will be comfortable and safe enough to be one of these, nominate you. So, you know, if you're training people like in our Garrett Lee program, then that building those relationships and that deep connection is, because maybe they're not suicidal in March 2020, but maybe they are in March 2022, and they'll remember that relationship and maybe down the road be able to rely on that adult. Is that fair to
Yeah.
say?
Absolutely. My guess is with your Garrett Lee Smith, I'm familiar with ours here in Michigan and Take Part, you're probably doing some gatekeeper training or a fair amount of gatekeeper training of teachers and other adults who are in the lives of youth. And I think when we're doing that, some of it is not just how to recognize risk, but what are you going to say and how do you approach? I think some of it's about the approach, to not be afraid to ask about difficult topics like thoughts of suicide, to sit back and listen and actually hear what the youth is saying and be able to tolerate some of their pain. One of the things that is really difficult for a good number of parents and other adults, it's tolerating that severe negative emotion and not trying to talk it away. Oh, you have a lot going for you, or avoid it altogether by not having the conversation. It's listening, hearing it, and then responding. And I think you're absolutely right, Virgil, that with these approaches, like you're surely doing with the Garrett Lee Smith, there's probably more and more adults that become comfortable and better at connecting with you. And they may be the very adults down the line that one or more of these youth might nominate.
Thank you. I see we're about at 1 o'clock. I'm wondering, I know Zara had one final question. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So we have a mentor program, as well as we have the clinical department, a mentorship program where we have high school and college age mentors that sometimes in combination with having a counselor, they also have a mentor, or instead of a counselor, they'll have a mentor to kind of help them with, life goals and just having a positive role model. And I was just wondering, I noticed the first version of the youth nominated support team, they could choose like more of a peer aged support person. And I was just wondering what some of the pros and cons you've seen to including at least one youth on their support team.
So we had more cons than pros, and it may have been partly because these are highly elevated risk, these teens. And the support people in YST, we don't intend them to be mental health professionals. We intend them to be caring people. They don't have responsibility for the youth's behavior. And one of the reasons was a con was just anxiety, in the sense of adults can understand that, but I always carried that. If one of these youth died, the peer support person, it's very difficult as a young person without a lot of life experience to not feel some responsibility. So I didn't like that part. But the actual data-driven drawbacks, one was that we had more dropout, because youth with a lot of emotional or behavioral difficulties, sometimes their relationships, to them, they're very intense, but they're not that stable. So they would nominate people who would be their support people, but then that person, that would change. And within 3 weeks or 6 weeks, the person had left them. And so we didn't have the same stability in the peer support people. And then the third reason was that we were trying to transition them from the hospital, and having a child be a support person, say ages 12 to 17, before they could begin, we had to get their parents to come in and sign the consent, and the whole process actually got delayed. I do see a role for peer counselors, peer-to-peer programs in schools. I think it's a little more difficult when you're working with such a high-risk group, and maybe that's a difference there.
I guess my last question would just be around I guess just for the sake of this being kind of a public services announcement of if you if any of our viewers are maybe concerned about a young person or even another adult, just some basic signs to look out for and what you can do, like National Suicide Hotline or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. We worked with a national group to say, how can we come up with some suicide warning signs where the list doesn't have 10 or 20 items on it? And I think there's a few big ones. So one is if a youth is talking about suicide, or you see that they've written notes about suicide, they've just made a suicide attempt. A second one is you see extreme, strong emotional pain. The youth is clearly distressed and in pain, maybe expressing hopelessness. And then if either of those is accompanied by worrisome behavioral signs. So what are worrisome behavioral signs? They're often changes, sleep disturbance, withdrawal from their usual friends and activities, highly agitated, more alcohol and drug use. But these worrisome behavioral signs, if they're accompanied by emotional pain, hopelessness, or suicidal thoughts, we really want to ask what's going on. I'm concerned about you. I wonder if you're down. I wonder if you've had thoughts of suicide. I would like to help. To ask to stay with them, to get the help that's needed. Certainly we have the National Lifeline. I hope you can share that number with the viewers. There's a crisis text line that is also good to share. Some youth now, there's these services where you can text with a trained counselor when extremely upset, or call. So there are options out there. In addition, of course, going to an adult if you're concerned about yourself or any peer, and getting help for that young person, getting a professional evaluation. But also, it's fine to call these national lifelines and crisis text lines. There's different ways to reach out and get help. The key is to reach out.
And the National Suicide Hotline is 1-800-273-8255. And we also have a new California mental health warm line. It's a peer-led hotline for anyone to call. That's 855-845-7415.
Thank you, Zara. And just one little point, just to bring it home in these times too. I'm just curious. You mentioned the texting. Is there some research or some promising findings that are showing benefits to reduction of ideation or suicide attempts around telebehavioral health texting?
Yeah, you froze for just a second, but I don't know that we have data to show that texting like a crisis line yet reduces suicide attempts. But I know that group is committed to research and working on it. I haven't seen any reports out from it yet.
The California Warm Line, their website, they also have an online chat option as well for just general mental health concerns.
I like the name, the Warm Line.
Yeah, instead of a hotline, it's warm.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a little bit of a lower threshold.
Yeah, and warmth,
Yeah.
There's warmth to people with warm personality, hopefully, on the other end.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll take it on. Thank you again. We'll take it on home. Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you, Zara, for this wonderful presentation and conversation. We had a lot of positive comments and questions that we'll try to get to on Facebook for those ones that we didn't get to. And then we'll also be continuing this speaker series on Thursday with Dr. Elliot Groves from the University of Washington, who's done some work around Indigenous suicide. a professor in education at University of Washington. So that will be at on Thursday at 12:30. So tune in. And again, thank you, Dr. King.
Yes,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.